She ran from a cruel marriage, and the Laird confined her in the castle to keep her safe. Lady Alara clutched her cloak tightly around her shoulders, her horse's hooves striking sparks from the wet stones as she rode through the jagged path. Behind her lay the estate she had once called home, a place of grandeur and gilded halls, now tainted with the memory of cruel words and cold hands. She had fled in the darkness, hoping the night would swallow her tracks and grant her freedom. Freedom. The word tasted strange on her tongue, like something distant, almost forgotten. Every moment she had spent in the hands of a husband she could not love, whose touch carried threats instead of warmth, had carved lines of fear and anger deep into her heart. She had endured silent dinners where his eyes lingered with accusation, nights filled with whispered commands, and the echo of doors slamming shut in finality. But now, as the cliffs rose sharply before her and the storm threatened to throw her from her path, she felt a fragile spark of courage. The forest loomed ahead, dark and tangled, with branches like grasping fingers. The path narrowed, the trees closing in until the world beyond seemed a distant memory. The wind moaned through the pines, carrying secrets from ages past. Alara slowed her horse, her eyes scanning the shadows. The stories of the northern lands were alive here, whispers of spirits, of old curses that lingered in abandoned halls, of creatures that watched travelers who dared the night. She pressed on, ignoring the prickle of fear that slid down her spine. And then she saw the castle. Perched on a cliff high above the roaring sea, it was a structure of stone and shadow, its towers like dark sentinels reaching into the storm-laden sky. Torches flickered in the ramparts, casting golden light that wavered and danced across the gray walls. It was not a welcoming sight, but it was shelter, and to Alara that was enough. Her horse neighed nervously as she drew closer to the massive gates. The drawbridge was down, and figures moved within the courtyard, shadows among shadows. One figure stepped forward, and Alara's breath caught. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his cloak dark as midnight and his eyes sharp, like a hawk watching the timid and the lost. There was a sternness in his gaze, but beneath it, Alara sensed a deep, unspoken intensity, a mixture of danger and authority that made her heart beat faster. "Who rides in the storm?" the man called, his voice echoing off the stone walls. I seek shelter," Alara replied, her voice trembling slightly but firm enough to reach his ears. "Please, I have nowhere else to go." He studied her for a long moment, his eyes scanning her face, the way she held herself despite exhaustion and fear. "A woman alone in these lands is a dangerous thing," he said finally. "This castle is not a place for travelers, yet you may stay if you follow the rules." Alara's heart surged with relief and something else she did not yet name, curiosity perhaps, or the faint flutter of hope. "I will follow your rules," she said, and the words tasted of iron and resolve. The drawbridge lowered fully, and the man, Laird Kale, as she would soon learn, led her horse into the courtyard. The wind buffeted them, but within the castle walls the storm seemed less fierce. Torches burned steadily along stone corridors, casting long shadows. Alara dismounted, her legs weak from hours of riding and tension. Kale handed her reins to a stable boy, who bowed without a word, eyes wide with awe or fear. "You will have a room," Kale said, his tone firm but not unkind. "Meals will be brought to you. You are safe here for now. Do not wander the halls at night." Alara nodded, the weight of gratitude and unease mingling in her chest. "I understand," she whispered. As she was led to her chamber, she felt the walls of the castle close around her, not in menace, but in certainty. This was a place of power, of history, of secrets buried deep in stone and shadow. Every corridor, every arch, every flickering torch seemed to speak of the past, of battles won and lost, of love and betrayal, of kings and queens whose names had been carved into the very foundations. Her room was simple yet warm, with a bed draped in heavy fabrics, a small fireplace, and a window overlooking the storm-tossed cliffs. She set down her cloak, trembling from the cold and the adrenaline, and allowed herself a moment to breathe. But even here, safe from the wind and rain, she could not shake the feeling that she had not yet escaped the dangers of her life. That night, sleep came fitfully. Alara lay beneath the heavy covers, listening to the storm batter the castle walls, to the distant crash of waves against the cliffs, and to the faint whispering of wind through the towers. And then she heard it, a soft echo, like the brush of a secret through the corridors. Someone or something moved outside her door. She rose cautiously, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders. The hallway was empty, lit by flickering torchlight, shadows stretching along the stone. Yet the whisper persisted, faint and almost melodic, carrying a warning she could not understand. Her heart beat faster. She took a tentative step forward and then another, drawn by a mixture of fear and curiosity. Suddenly, a voice spoke from the shadows. "You should not be wandering these halls, Lady Alara." She spun, heart racing, and found herself face to face with Laird Kale. He stood in the torchlight, his expression unreadable, yet his presence was commanding, impossible to ignore. "I warned you," he said, and there was no anger in his tone, only an unwavering certainty. I heard something," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I could not sleep." He stepped closer, and she noticed the faint scar that traced his jaw, the hardened line of his lips, the weight of battles he had endured, not just with enemies but with life itself. "This castle is old," he said softly, "and the winds carry voices that are not always friendly. There are dangers both within these walls and outside them. You are not safe, not yet. That is why I keep watch." Alara's chest tightened. She wanted to argue, to insist that she needed no protector, that she could find her own way. Yet something in his gaze held her, a promise of protection mingled with an unspoken warning. She realized with a shiver that the night itself seemed to lean toward him, as if the wind and stone acknowledged his power. "I thank you," she whispered, unable to say more. Kale nodded once sharply and turned away. But before he left, he spoke again, his voice softer this time, almost hesitant. "You are not as alone as you believe, Lady Alara. The world is dark, yes, but it also has its guardians. And I will guard you whether you wish it or not." Alara watched him disappear down the hall, her heart fluttering with confusion, guarded yet compelling, stern yet kind in the quietest way. She did not yet understand him, or the storm that brewed in his heart, but she felt its pull, and it unsettled her more than any wind or shadow ever could. The night stretched on, and sleep finally claimed her, though her dreams were restless. She wandered through corridors that seemed alive with memory, saw faces in the shadows that were not there when she woke, and felt the faint brush of unseen hands guiding her steps. She awoke at dawn to the sound of gulls and the first light spilling over the cliffs, painting the sea in molten gold and silver. Stepping to the window, she breathed deeply of the cold, bracing air. Beyond the cliff's edge, the waves roared, relentless and untamed. She thought of the life she had left behind, of doors slammed, of whispered threats, of nights spent in fear. And then she thought of the castle, its walls ancient and strong, and of Laird Kale, whose presence was both a restraint and a comfort. Freedom, she realized, was not merely the absence of chains. It was also the courage to face what lay ahead, storms, shadows, and the uncertain pull of a heart she did not yet understand. And as the sun rose over the northern cliffs, spilling light across the castle's gray stones, Alara made a silent promise to herself. She would survive, she would endure, and she would discover whether the guardian of this castle was friend, protector, or something far more complicated. But even as hope stirred in her chest, a whisper of fear lingered, carried by the wind through the towers. The castle had secrets, and some of them were waiting for her, secrets that could change everything. And somewhere deep in the castle, in the shadows where torches flickered and the stones remembered, Kale watched. And he, too, wondered if the woman who had run from cruelty would survive the storm he could not shield her from. The morning sun broke through the storm clouds, casting a pale light over the castle's gray stone walls. Lady Alara stood at her window, the wind tugging at her cloak, her eyes tracing the jagged cliffs where the waves crashed below. Though the storm had passed, a tension lingered in the air, a quiet warning that danger could arrive without notice. Breakfast was a quiet affair. Servants moved quickly through the hall, bringing plates of bread, cheese, and steaming tea. Cale sat at the head of the table, his expression as stern as ever, yet his eyes softened when they met hers. There was an intensity in his gaze, a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and something she could not yet name. "You have not slept well," he said, his voice low, careful. Alara shook her head. "The castle, it feels alive at night. I heard whispers in the hall and shadows moved where there should be none." Cale's jaw tightened. "It is an old place. It holds memory, pain, joy, betrayal. The stones themselves remember. You are safe here, but you must be cautious. Curiosity can be dangerous." "I am not afraid," she replied, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. He studied her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Bravery is not the absence of fear, Lady Alara. It is knowing the danger and choosing to face it anyway." The words struck her. They were simple, yet profound, as if they were meant not only for her safety but to teach her something she had forgotten long ago, that she was capable of courage. After breakfast, Cale guided her through the castle. He showed her the rooms she could use, the corridors she should avoid, and the battlements where she could look out over the cliffs. Alara noticed the way he moved through the halls with certainty, each step measured, as if he knew every stone, every shadow, every hidden passage. She wondered what stories were etched into his past, what battles he had faced that made him so careful, so exacting. "You are always so precise," she said softly as they paused near the library, where rows of ancient books stretched from floor to ceiling. "I must be," he replied. "The world is not kind to those who are careless, and this castle, it holds many secrets. One wrong step can change everything." Alara glanced at the books, their spines cracked with age, the titles faded. "Secrets?" she asked. Cale's gaze darkened. "Yes. Some are dangerous, others merely cautionary, but all have a purpose. You will learn in time that the world is not as simple as it appears." As the days passed, Alara grew accustomed to the rhythm of the castle. She rose with the sun, wandered the corridors under Cale's watchful eye, and spent hours in the library, reading books of history, legend, and lore. She discovered stories of kings and queens, of battles fought over honor and pride, of curses whispered into existence by vengeful hearts. She began to understand that the world she had escaped from, her former husband, the political games, the threats, was only one layer of a deeper, darker reality. Cale, meanwhile, watched her carefully. He observed the way her hands moved over the books, the light in her eyes when she discovered a new story, the strength she carried beneath her fear. He knew the danger of letting someone so spirited wander too freely, yet he found himself drawn to her determination, her courage, her refusal to be broken. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the castle was bathed in twilight, a messenger arrived. His horse was weary, his cloak soaked with rain, and his eyes held a hint of urgency. He bowed low before Cale. "My lord, news from the northern lands," the messenger said. "Lord Riven has taken interest in Lady Alara. He claims she belongs to him, by law and by bloodline agreement." Alara's heart clenched. Lord Riven, her former husband's ally, a man known for his cunning and ambition, was now a threat she could not ignore. She had fled to escape his reach, and yet here he was, determined to reclaim her. Cale's expression hardened. "He will not enter this castle while I live," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "No harm will come to you, not by him, not by anyone." Alara felt a flicker of gratitude, mixed with unease. She had escaped one danger only to find herself in another. though this one was tempered by the presence of a man who was both protector and enigma. That night she wandered the battlements, the wind whipping her hair around her face. The sea below roared like a living thing, and the cliffs seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. Cale joined her silently, standing a few paces away, his cloak flapping in the wind. "You fear him," he said, not as a question but as a statement. "I do," she admitted, "but I also fear what might happen if I stay here and do nothing." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Fear is not weakness, it is a guide. It tells you where danger lies, where caution is needed, where courage must rise." Alara turned to face him fully, the moonlight casting his features in stark relief. She saw the strength in his posture, the shadows beneath his eyes that spoke of battles fought and losses endured. And she realized something else, that behind the stern exterior, there was a man who had known love and betrayal, whose heart bore scars as deep as her own. The days that followed were tense. Lord Riven's emissaries approached the castle, seeking to negotiate, to intimidate, to claim what he believed was his. Cale met each threat with calm authority, demonstrating both power and restraint. Alara watched, fascinated and unsettled, as the man who had seemed so rigid revealed layers of strategy, honor, and unspoken emotion. She began to understand that the castle, for all its stone and shadow, was not merely a prison for her safety. It was a place of preparation, a crucible where strength, courage, and wit were honed. And in that crucible she discovered her own resilience. She learned to speak with authority, to stand tall when fear whispered lies, to trust the instincts that had guided her away from a life of cruelty. One evening, while exploring a lesser-known wing of the castle, she found a door hidden behind a tapestry. It was small, heavy, and unmarked, as if it had been forgotten by time. Curiosity surged through her, stronger than caution. She pressed her hand against the cold wood, feeling the pulse of the castle beneath her fingers. The door creaked open to reveal a narrow staircase leading downward. The air was cooler here, tinged with the scent of earth and stone. Shadows moved in the corners, and Alara felt a thrill of fear and excitement. She descended carefully, each step echoing softly. At the bottom, she found a chamber unlike any other in the castle. Shelves lined with ancient tomes, jars of herbs, and curious artifacts filled the room. Candles flickered, casting dancing shadows across the walls. And in the center of the room, a small, carved chest rested on a pedestal, its surface etched with symbols she did not recognize. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside were papers, old and fragile, written in a hand that was both elegant and strange. They spoke of a curse, tied to her bloodline, a shadow that had waited through generations to rise again. Her heart pounded. The danger she had fled, the threats she had feared, were only part of a larger web she had yet to understand. Footsteps sounded above, and she turned quickly, closing the chest. Cale appeared at the top of the stairs, his expression unreadable. "You should not be here," he said quietly, though there was no anger in his voice, only concern. I found something," she said, her voice shaking. "Something about a curse about my family." Cale descended the stairs slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "You are stronger than you realize," he said. "And yet, there are forces at work here that even I cannot fully control. You must trust me and yourself. Only then can we face what is coming." Alara felt a mixture of fear and trust, a delicate tension that pulled at her heart. She wanted to protest, to insist that she could face this alone. And yet, standing there with Cale close and the shadows of the chamber surrounding them, she knew the truth. She was not alone, and she had never truly been free. Not until she faced the storm ahead, and not until she understood the bond forming between them, a bond that was both protection and awakening. That night, as she lay in her chamber, she could not sleep. The wind whispered through the towers, carrying secrets she did not yet understand. And in the quiet, she realized that her life had changed irrevocably. The castle, the Laird, the threat of the curse, They were all part of a new world, one she must navigate with courage and care. And somewhere deep in the halls, Cale watched as shadows moved across the stone. He thought of the woman who had fled cruelty, who now faced the unknown with a strength she did not fully recognize. And he wondered if the danger was not only outside the castle, but also inside their hearts, where fear, longing, and desire intertwined in ways neither of them could yet control. For in the days to come, the web of power, secrets, and destiny would tighten around them both, and choices would be demanded that could change the course of their lives forever. The wind had changed. No longer the storm that had driven her to the castle. It was now a cold, lingering gust that whispered through the corridors and rattled the windows. Lady Alara stood at her window, watching the cliffs where the waves crashed endlessly. Her mind had not rested since the discovery of the hidden chamber beneath the castle. The curse tied to her bloodline haunted her thoughts. The papers she had found spoke of shadows that waited for generations, of a darkness that could rise and claim what was owed. Alara had always thought of herself as cautious, careful, and strong, but now she realized that strength alone might not be enough. She needed knowledge, courage, and something else, something she could not yet name. Cale entered the room quietly. He moved with his usual calm, but there was tension in his shoulders, a sharp edge in his gaze. "You should not dwell on the curse alone," he said. "It will cloud your mind and your judgment. The more you fear it, the stronger it becomes." "I cannot ignore it," Alara replied, her voice soft but determined. "It is part of who I am and perhaps part of what brought me here." Cale studied her, and she felt the weight of his gaze, both protective and searching. "Then we face it together," he said finally. "But you must trust me and trust yourself. The shadows you fear are clever and patient. They will test you in ways you cannot yet imagine." Over the next days, the castle became more than a sanctuary. It became a battleground of unseen forces, of whispers and fleeting shadows that moved when no one else was near. Alara learned to navigate the corridors with care, listening to the creaks and sighs of the castle as if it were a living being. Sometimes she would see shapes in the corner of her vision, dark, fleeting, almost unreal. And always there was the sense that the castle itself was alive with memory, waiting for the right moment to reveal its secrets. Cale stayed near, yet not oppressively. He taught her the hidden ways of the castle, secret staircases, narrow passages, and vantage points where she could observe the cliffs and the sea below. At first, Alara resisted, but slowly she began to understand his wisdom. The castle, he explained, was not only a fortress of stone, it was a place of preparation. The outside world was dangerous, full of enemies and schemes, but the castle taught patience, strategy, and courage. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned shades of red and gold, Alara and Cale walked along the battlements. The air was sharp and cold, but the colors of the sunset warmed her spirit. "You think too much," Cale said softly, watching her face. "I cannot help it," she replied. "There is so much to understand, so much at stake. I feel as if my life, my fate, is not entirely my own anymore." "And yet," he said, his voice lower, almost a whisper, "you hold power that others do not. Courage, wisdom, and the will to endure. That is why you are here and why the shadows linger. They recognize strength when they see it." Alara turned to him, her heart stirring at his words. There was an intimacy in them, a recognition that neither fear nor circumstance could erase. She wanted to speak, to ask questions, to voice her curiosity, but the wind stole her words. Instead, she simply nodded, feeling the weight of both his protection and his understanding. That night, a messenger arrived once more, carrying news that Lord Riven had grown impatient. He had gathered allies and intended to make his claim for Alara, regardless of the laws or the castle's protections. The messenger's eyes flicked nervously to Cale, and Alara felt a tightening in her chest. Danger was approaching, not the distant kind she had fled from, but one that would test everything she had learned, and perhaps everything she feared to feel. Cale responded with his usual calm. "We will be ready. The castle is not only stone and mortar. It is a home, a fortress, and a shield, and we will not yield." Alara's role became clearer as the days passed. She assisted in planning, learned how to anticipate threats, and discovered a quiet strength in herself that she had never acknowledged. She began to understand the subtleties of power, how words, presence, and careful choices could shape outcomes as effectively as swords. And through it all, Cale was near, guiding her, sometimes challenging her, but always respecting her growing strength. The nights, however, were a different kind of trial. Shadows moved where they should not have, and whispers seemed to crawl through the halls. One evening, Alara ventured into the hidden chamber again, unable to resist the pull of knowledge. She studied the ancient texts, the notes on rituals, and the fragments of spells that might ward off the curse. Every word filled her with awe and fear. The castle had kept these secrets for centuries, waiting for the right moment, or the right person, to confront them. Cale appeared silently behind her. "You push yourself too far," he said. "The knowledge is dangerous, but you are wise to seek it. Fear alone will not protect you. Courage and understanding will." Alara looked at him, noticing the shadow beneath his eyes, the set of his jaw, the tension in his hands. He bore his own burdens, and yet he remained steadfast. "I am not afraid," she said, though her voice betrayed a tremor. "I must know what I face. I cannot run from it anymore." He studied her for a long moment, then placed a hand lightly on her shoulder. "And you will face it, not alone. That is what I have promised. That is what I intend to keep." Days passed into weeks, and the threat of Lord Riven loomed closer. Scouts reported his movements, his allies plotting, and the castle prepared for confrontation. Alara trained with the guards, learning to move with purpose and awareness. Every moment was a lesson in strength, patience, and the power of presence. And through it all, the connection between her and Cale deepened, silent yet undeniable. There were glances that lingered longer than necessary, a warmth in his tone when he spoke to her, a sense of shared understanding that neither could fully articulate. One night, as the moon rose high over the cliffs, Alara felt a pull she could not ignore. She walked to the battlements, the sea stretching endlessly below, and allowed herself to breathe in the night. Cale joined her quietly, standing a few steps away, his eyes reflecting the moonlight. "There is something in the air," Alara said softly, "something alive. I feel it moving through the castle." "Yes," Cale replied, "the shadows are restless. They have waited long for this moment, for the right strength to face. And now you are here." Alara felt a thrill of fear and anticipation. She realized that the curse was not only a threat, it was a challenge, a test, and perhaps even an opportunity to claim her own power. The shadows would not bow to fear nor to weakness. Only courage, wisdom, and determination could shape their outcome. Cale stepped closer, his presence grounding her. "You are ready," he said, "and yet you must trust not only me but yourself. The shadows will try to divide, to confuse, to weaken, but your heart will guide you if you let it." For a long moment they stood in silence, the wind tugging at their cloaks, the waves crashing endlessly below. In that silence, Alara felt a strange mixture of longing and reassurance. She was not alone. She had never truly been alone. And perhaps in the face of danger, of curses, of the unknown, she might discover something she had never allowed herself to hope for, a bond of trust and shared strength, one that neither fear nor darkness could break. But the shadows would not wait. That same night, a sound echoed through the castle halls, soft, deliberate, and chilling. Figures moved in the dark, unseen yet sensed. Alara awoke, her heart racing, the wind carrying a faint whisper of warning. She knew, with a certainty that sent a shiver down her spine, that the true test of courage, trust, and strength had begun. And somewhere in the shadowed halls, Cale listened as well, his hand brushing against the stone wall, his mind alert to every sound. The castle held its breath, the curse stirred, and their fates, intertwined and uncertain, were about to collide with forces older and darker than either could yet imagine. Alara clenched her fists, her eyes hard with determination. She would face whatever came. She would endure. She would fight, not only for herself, but for the man who had become both her protector and her guide, for the bond that had begun to form between them, and for the destiny that awaited beyond the shadows. And in the quiet, beneath the moonlight and the watchful towers, the castle seemed to whisper a warning and a promise. The shadows had risen. The storm was not yet over. And the bond between two hearts, fragile yet unbroken, would be tested as never before. The storm had returned, though this one was not born of clouds and wind alone. It was a storm of shadows and whispers, of dangers that had waited centuries for the right moment to awaken. Lady Alara stood on the battlements, her cloak whipping around her in the cold wind, her eyes tracing the cliffs below where the waves crashed like ancient drums. She felt the weight of the castle pressing against her back, a fortress of stone and memory, and the pulse of the darkness that had followed her for so long. Beside her, Laird stood silently, his cloak dark against the gray stone, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He had prepared for this moment for days, sharpened defenses, instructed the guards, and studied the ancient texts she had discovered. But even with all his preparation, he knew the danger they faced now was unlike any other. The curse that had stirred beneath her bloodline was awake, and it would not be restrained by walls or steel. "We cannot face this like a normal battle," Kale said, his voice low, carrying both urgency and calm authority. "This is a test of strength, courage, and will. And we will face it together." Alara nodded, gripping the railing. She felt fear, yes, but also determination, a fire kindling in her chest that refused to be extinguished. "I am ready," she said softly, though she knew the road ahead would demand more than courage. It would demand trust, clarity, and the willingness to face herself. As darkness fell, the first shadows appeared. They crept along the stone walls, flickering and twisting, forming shapes that seemed almost alive. Whispers rose, soft and melodic, promising despair and confusion. Alara's pulse quickened, but she did not step back. She had learned patience, observation, and strategy in the weeks she had spent in the castle. She would not falter now. Kale placed a hand on her shoulder, grounding her. "Do not fear them," he said. "They are strong, but they are not greater than the will to fight, nor greater than the bond we share. Trust yourself and trust me." Alara inhaled deeply, feeling the power of his words and the presence of his steadiness. She nodded, and together they moved toward the heart of the castle, where the curse seemed strongest. The air grew colder, the shadows thicker, and the whispers more insistent. They entered the chamber where she had first discovered the hidden texts, the very place where the curse's energy had first made itself known. The shadows surged, forming shapes she could almost recognize, faces twisted in sorrow, figures reaching for her, and echoes of long-forgotten voices. But Alara did not run. She remembered every lesson she had learned, every strength she had discovered in herself. And she remembered Kale's steady presence beside her, a tether to courage, a shield of trust. "Focus," he whispered. "The shadows feed on fear. Take control of your mind, your heart, your will. They cannot touch what is resolute." Alara closed her eyes, centering herself. She imagined the castle as a fortress not only of stone, but of spirit. She felt the pulse of her own bloodline, the strength of generations before her, and the courage that had carried her from her cruel past to this very moment. Slowly, deliberately, she reached out with her mind, her heart, and her will. The shadows hesitated, flickered, and twisted, as if confused by her unwavering determination. Kale moved beside her, his own presence radiating strength and calm. He placed a hand lightly on her back, and she felt a warmth that countered the cold and fear of the room. Together, they faced the darkness, their hearts aligned, their minds clear. The shadows writhed, twisted, and then began to dissipate, melting into the corners and walls until the chamber was bathed in soft, golden torchlight. Alara opened her eyes and exhaled, her hands trembling slightly. "It's over," she said, though she knew that the curse, though weakened, might linger in hidden forms. Kale shook his head gently. "Not over," he said, "but controlled. You have faced it. You have endured. That is the first step toward breaking what has haunted your bloodline for centuries." For a long moment they simply stood there, the quiet of the chamber filled with the weight of their shared struggle. Alara felt a strange sense of peace, mingled with exhaustion and relief. She looked at Kale, noticing the shadows beneath his eyes, the tension in his jaw, and the deep care in his gaze. And for the first time she realized the depth of what had grown between them, not mere gratitude, but something profound, forged in trust, courage, and shared trial. "You were incredible," Kale said softly, his voice carrying warmth and admiration. "You faced fear as if it were nothing, yet you embraced it fully. That is strength few possess." Alara felt her cheeks warm, both from his words and the closeness of the moment. "I could not have done it without you," she admitted. "You guided me, protected me, believed in me when I was afraid to believe in myself." He stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. "And I could not have faced it without you," he said. "You remind me that courage is not just about protecting others. It is about standing beside them, trusting them, and allowing oneself to care." The wind outside the castle walls moaned softly, as if the cliffs themselves were bearing witness. Alara felt the tension that had grown between them, the quiet longing, the unspoken recognition of connection, settle into something tangible, though unspoken. They had faced darkness, supernatural forces, and threats from men alike, and they had emerged together, stronger and more resolute. The following days brought calm, though the castle remained vigilant. Scouts reported that Lord Riven had withdrawn for the time being, intimidated by the castle's fortifications and by the strength of its defenders. Alara continued her studies in the library, her confidence growing with each passing hour. She explored the castle's secret passages, practiced the strategies Kale had taught her, and strengthened her own mind and spirit. But it was not just knowledge she gained. It was understanding, the understanding that courage, trust, and love were intertwined in ways that could not be measured by battle or by strategy alone. Kale's presence remained a constant, a reminder that strength was not only in oneself, but in the bonds forged with others. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of red and gold, Kale led her to the highest tower of the castle. From there, the cliff stretched endlessly, the sea shimmering in twilight. The wind was brisk, carrying the scent of salt and freedom. "You have grown stronger," he said, his voice quiet. "Not just in skill or courage, but in heart. You face what others flee. And yet, there is more to come. The world beyond these walls is not kind, and your path will continue to demand everything you possess." Alara looked at him, her eyes reflecting the fading light. "I am ready," she said. "I know now that strength is not only about surviving, it is about trusting, believing, and standing with those who matter." He nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "Then you are prepared for what comes next, and I am glad to have stood beside you. You have taught me as much as I have guided you." The quiet between them was profound, filled with shared understanding, mutual respect, and the subtle stirrings of something deeper. For weeks, months perhaps, they had faced danger, fear, and darkness together. And in that crucible something had grown, a bond neither could deny, forged in courage, trust, and the quiet intimacy of shared struggle. Alara felt a sense of closure, not only for the immediate danger, but for the fear that had haunted her since the beginning of her flight. She had faced the shadows of the castle, the whispers of the curse, and the threats that lingered from the world she had left behind. And she had emerged stronger, wiser, and more certain of herself than she had ever been. Kale watched her, noting the subtle changes, the way her shoulders carried less tension, the way her eyes shone with confidence and clarity, the faint smile that touched her lips even in thought. He knew that the curse had not only tested her, but had revealed the strength and resilience that had always been within her. And he felt a quiet pride, mingled with something more profound, something that stirred in his chest with every glance they exchanged. That night the castle was calm. The wind had softened, the shadows receded, and the torches burned steadily in the halls. Alara stood by her window, looking out over the cliffs and the restless sea. She felt the weight of her past and the promise of her future, intertwined like threads of silver and shadow. She knew that challenges would come again, that life beyond the castle walls would demand courage and wisdom. But she also knew that she was no longer alone, and that the bond she shared with Kale would guide them both through whatever lay ahead. And somewhere in the quiet halls of the castle, Kale watched as well, his gaze fixed on her silhouette against the moonlight. The shadows had retreated, the curse had been faced, and the storm, though never fully gone, had been tempered. For the first time he allowed himself to hope, not only for victory over darkness, but for the promise of something brighter, forged in trust, courage, and shared hearts. Together they had faced the unknown, confronted the curse, and emerged stronger, bound not by fear or obligation, but by choice and understanding. And in that choice lay the true power, the redemption that neither of them had expected, but both had earned. The castle walls, once cold and foreboding, now seemed alive with memory and promise. And as the moon rose over the northern cliffs, Alara and Kale stood side by side, ready to face the world beyond, together. The storm had passed, but the bond it forged would endure, unbroken, shining brighter than the darkest shadows the world could cast.